Alright guys, welcome back. In today's episode we are going to cover the tail light on this Mugen Civic. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. So whenever I start a new section of an illustration, I kind of go through and get my layers right. Since I work in lots of layers, I like to make sure I go through, turn off layers that I don't need, and lock layers that I don't need. So in this illustration, I have the right tail light and the left tail light separated into two individual layers. So right now I have them named the same. So before we get started, let's change that from right to left. I know normally I work with passenger and driver, but I feel like with this one, seeing as how it's quite literal, right and left, I just named them accordingly. Okay, so now we're working on the right tail light. You can see now that we have the main path shape for that turned off and all of the layers locked that we're not going to need. So working from the bottom up, I'm going to select this very dark gray color, and then we'll turn this off, and then we will start drawing the darkest reds first. So I have a nice red selected already for the fill color. So I'm just going to go through and draw several shapes and paths that would essentially be assigned this darker red color. And again, in the beginning of trying, a new area of the car, the colors usually will change as I go through the illustration. Now, with each illustration that I do, I'm trying to get more detail out of the headlights and the taillights. So that was one of the reasons why I chose this particular Civic, and that is one of the reasons why you see me start to draw individual paths over and over again. So when I zoom out here each time, I am looking to see if I am creating depth with this particular part of the taillight that I'm working with. I don't necessarily want it to look flat. I do want it to appear as though it is recessed within that housing. So that requires lots of going back and changing colors and testing new things and undoing them. So I try to see that bright red there. It doesn't work. I undo it. And I'm trying to just by looking at it, get an idea of what I need to add or change. And I'm really liking this darker red. It doesn't need to be quite as literal as you may think. So now I'm going to go through and draw a few highlights. So the next time I zoom out, it should be a little more clear on if I am creating the depth of field that I'm looking for. Trying to keep these little individual paths as random as possible. There's a way Illustrator can generate these paths for you. Some view it as cheating, some view it as help, but we will eventually go over that technique in an upcoming video. I believe it's probably the next illustration after we're done with this Civic. So I'm getting ready to enlarge my layers palette, and you're not going to be able to see everything on this path, but basically, or this layer, but basically what I'm doing is I'm going through and I am going to select all of these little red shapes that we just drew that's on this black housing. So there you can see they're all selected, and I'm going to hit Command G on my keyboard to turn those all into one group. This will help things as we go along to not get out of control in this layers palette, and I can always click to open it up and see the individual paths inside. So let's name this right outer, just so that we can keep track of it and it doesn't clutter up this particular layer while we work with so many other pieces of it. Okay, so we are essentially going to do the same thing to the inner light that is on the trunk of the car. So I'm basically just going through with the same colors that I've used for the outer part of the tail light, and I'm just going to go through and roughly outline several rough shapes to basically just try to get an idea of how this taillight's going to look. It's kind of like the wheels from the BMW as well, where you're just basically creating a bunch of random shapes, and you're not going to be able to tell if it's going to work out until you kind of have them all filled in and have zoomed out to check your work. So we're going to do that right now and see how that looks. And that's looking relatively believable. So I'm just going to go through and clean up a couple of these shapes. And those are looking pretty good. So we're going to do the same thing for the inner part of this tail light that we did with the outer part of this tail light. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to lock the parts of the layer that I don't want to select so that I can just drag my mouse over this section. Hit Command G on my keyboard, and we're going to name this group within this layer the right inner. And now our layer is much shorter, and we don't have to scroll through our layers palette to find where we are if we want to go through and make a correction later on. So now I'm just adding a few more pieces and moving on to the gray and the white section of this tail light, these bottom clear section here. And how I like to usually start is by making a general shape, almost like the background or the background part of this next section, and then layer on top of that individual shapes to bring out the detail in this section of the tail light. So one particular exercise that I'm challenging myself to do with this taillight illustration is to draw each shape individually. When there are repeatable shapes like this section here, I'll draw the main shape and then just repeat it by holding Control or Command while I drag my mouse over. And sometimes if I need to squish one or adjust a shape, I will do that individually. Now, I went back and forth a little bit on whether I should draw each one of these paths individually, but then I decided to just use the rounded rectangle tool to create these lines so they're actually shapes instead of just lines with a stroke assigned to them. So they're rounded rectangle shapes, and this way they all maintain the same characteristics, but they differ in size. That keeps the drawing a little bit more consistent, and I don't have to draw each shape individually. Great. So this is coming together along nicely. We just have a few more highlights to go in and draw now that we're almost done wrapping up the gray. We'll go in and add some highlights now, just to kind of fill out this section and try to make it a little random. Don't want it to be too perfect. Okay, now I want to select all of these just like I've done in the previous sections and group this all together. That way I can just turn it off and get some of this mess out of my way while I draw some highlights. Again, I'm just using the rounded rectangle and kind of going over each shape. This helps me speed up the process, and I don't have to use the pen tool unless I'm doing something a little more complicated like this highlight on the corner. Okay, now time for the reflection. It's kind of got this weird reflection because it's parked in a city, so you're kind of drawing a reflection of city buildings. So just following this around, and I'll just fill this with white, and then I'll set the opacity down probably somewhere like 10 or 20. We'll see. Great. Okay, so we'll fill that and we'll go to the transparency dialog box and I'll bring that down. 44% looks nice. Maybe even more than that. We'll zoom out and see how realistic that looks. Bring it down to 30. That's a little better. All right. So now we basically just need to repeat all of that, but on the intersection of this passenger taillight. So since we already have this section drawn and grouped, I'll just turn this back on, and when I start to draw the individual paths, I will have a color palette to sample from. Repeat these shapes. So the amount of detail that you put into a particular part of the illustration is up to you. I wanted to draw this car particularly for this taillight. I wanted to challenge myself with all the little bits and pieces, so that's why I'm taking a great amount of care in the detail in each one of these highlights and shadows of this particular taillight. As you can see, they are pretty much a lot of repeatable shapes, and this is a particularly fun challenge to get as much detail out of this taillight as possible, since this is why I chose to draw this particular Civic in the first place. So as always, thanks for watching and hitting that like button. If you're interested in more Adobe Illustrator CC tutorials and other car-related nonsense, consider subscribing and hitting that bell. Also, be sure to check out my Instagram and Patreon pages, which are linked below, and I will catch you guys in the next one.